It's a strange thing, realizing you've given everything to a place that has quietly decided you no longer belong. The room is quiet, the soft hum of the refrigerator the only sound cutting through the stillness. A chair, once taken for granted, now feels alien in its absence. The seat at the head of the table, where you once sat with ease, is now empty, as though someone else's presence has taken priority. No one says a word about it, but the shift is undeniable, a subtle yet constant reminder that you're not at the center anymore. Around the table, conversations flow without you, like rivers that no longer need your shores. The clinking of dishes, the soft laughter that fills the air, all come and go, but it feels as though you're watching it from a distance, your place in the rhythm of it all fading. It used to be different. You can almost remember the way it felt to belong here. The warmth of the fire, the smell of dinner cooking, the sound of footsteps echoing in the hallway as someone came to sit next to you. But now, that warmth is colder, the footsteps quieter, and your presence, once vital, is now optional. You're part of the background, a fixture no one seems to notice until it's time to clear the table, to make room for the next. The memories flicker, fleeting glimpses of moments that should have mattered. The birthday parties you were excluded from, the family photos you were suddenly left out of, the holidays where you found yourself staring at the empty chair where you used to sit. Each moment is a small betrayal, a quiet dismissal, a message that you were never really meant to stay. It all starts to add up, the glances, the shifting of seats, the laughter that's not quite for you. It's not anger that rises in your chest, but something colder, a bitter realization that you were never really a part of the plan. You were an afterthought, a placeholder until the real connections could form. The feeling sinks deep, like a stone dropped in your stomach. It's not the loud, obvious pain of rejection that you feel. It's something more insidious, creeping in like the silence after an argument that's never truly resolved. You never raised your voice. You didn't make a scene. Instead, you just stayed, hoping that maybe one day things would change, that the seat would be pulled out for you again. But now, you see it clearly, the truth that you've been quietly edged out. The reality hits with the weight of finality. You were never the priority. You were always secondary. The anger doesn't come in waves. It comes in an overwhelming quiet, unknowing. You were replaced, not by another person, but by the idea of someone who mattered more, who fit better, who was easier to love. You've given so much of yourself, but it's never been enough. And now, the silence becomes the loudest thing in the room. A gentle voice in the back of your mind whispers that it's time to reclaim what was taken, to walk away from the table and leave them to their illusions. The seat, empty and cold, will always be there. But you are not. You are something more than a memory, more than a shadow. And as you slowly stand, you know this is the moment you've been waiting for. No more pretending. No more waiting for their approval. The space you once occupied is now yours to fill in a way that only you can. The dinner table is set as if nothing has changed, the same plates, the same silverware, but the air feels heavier than it used to. The clinking of utensils is louder now, almost intrusive, each sound more pronounced in the stillness. She sits at the far end of the table, her place untouched, as it has been for weeks. It used to be that she sat next to him, close enough to exchange quiet words, but now there's an empty space between them. A gap she feels more with every passing second. Her hand rests on the table, fingers tracing the edge of her glass, the cool surface a reminder of the warmth that has long since faded. She watches the others around the table, their conversations flowing effortlessly, while she remains silent, the words that she used to speak now lingering unspoken in her throat. It's not that anyone has told her she's unwelcome, no harsh words, no confrontation. It's just the way the conversation shifts when she speaks, the way the eyes that once met hers now glance away, as though avoiding the very thing she has to say. He, her husband, sits across from her, his focus fixed on the plate in front of him, never once lifting his eyes to meet hers. The chair next to her, once his, now occupied by someone else, a subtle sign, a message that she was never meant to stay in that space. It's the small things that hurt the most. The shift in where she sits, the way her presence is acknowledged only when necessary, the way everyone seems to have their own conversations, their own world, leaving her out of it. Her gaze drifts across the room, landing on the pictures on the wall, The family portraits that used to be filled with smiles, but now they seem distant, like relics of a time she can barely remember. She's still part of the image, still part of the family, but she's no longer part of the moment. The air feels colder, not in temperature, but in the way it wraps around her, a chilling reminder that she's been left out. She watches them laugh, the way they move so freely, with ease, while she remains still, frozen in the uncomfortable silence of her own thoughts. The room feels smaller now, the walls closing in, and the weight of her isolation presses down on her chest, a pressure she can't shake. She catches a glimpse of his face, a brief flicker of a smile directed at the others, but never at her. His eyes, once warm, now avoid hers as if afraid to confront what's been happening between them. The subtle shifts, the coldness, the way she's slowly been pushed aside. These things were never said out loud, never acknowledged, but they're impossible to ignore. The silence speaks louder than any argument ever could, and in that silence, she realizes she's no longer part of the family's rhythm, no longer the one they turn to for comfort, for love. She is an observer now, sitting in the space that used to be hers, watching as the world around her continues on without her. The food on her plate goes cold, untouched, as she sits, her eyes fixed on the empty seat next to her, the one she once shared with him. The quiet humiliation of being overlooked, of being invisible in the very place that once felt like home, weighs on her. No one says anything, no one acknowledges the space she no longer occupies, but she feels it. The distance, the coldness, the subtle reminder that she no longer matters. Her fingers tighten around the edge of her glass, her knuckles white with the effort to hold back the tears that threaten to fall. She doesn't speak, doesn't make a scene, but the emptiness she feels is louder than any word she could say. The others continue on, their laughter echoing around her, but it sounds hollow now, distant, as if it's happening in another room altogether. She is here, but she is not. She watches as they move through the motions of family life, and for the first time, she wonders if she'll ever find her place again, or if she's been erased from their story altogether. The kitchen was warm then, filled with the comforting scent of roasting chicken and fresh herbs, a place where she once felt most at home. It was late afternoon, the light filtering softly through the blinds, casting long shadows on the walls. She stood at the counter, chopping vegetables, listening to the low hum of the conversation around her. They were talking about the upcoming family reunion, their voices light, filled with excitement. She had been included in those conversations, not long ago, a key part of the plans. But as she glanced over her shoulder, she noticed something that didn't quite sit right. Her mother-in-law, standing near the stove, was speaking in hushed tones with her husband, the conversation too quiet for her to catch the words, but loud enough for her to feel the subtle exclusion. She had been part of this family for years, but now, in this moment, the space between them felt vast, as though a line had been drawn that she couldn't see but could clearly feel. She continued to chop the vegetables, her movements mechanical, trying to shake the unease that crawled over her. It wasn't a loud gesture, nothing that would have caused a scene. No one raised their voice, no one pointed fingers. It was just a shift in the air, a change in the way they looked at her, the way they spoke when she wasn't there. She had seen it before, but in those moments, she brushed it off, telling herself it was nothing. The subtle ways they moved without her, without even noticing. She thought it was just the rhythm of life, that things were always changing, that the family was growing and evolving, and maybe she was just too sensitive. But now, looking back, she realizes how much of herself she gave, how much she adapted to fit into the space that was once hers. The dinners, the holidays, the quiet mornings spent together, all of those moments that made her feel like she belonged. But in the shadows of those memories, there were always these small, quiet signs. The times her opinions were dismissed with a polite smile, the way her seat at the table was always just a little farther away, the way her input was less and less valued. She didn't see it for what it was at the time, because it was easier to pretend that things hadn't changed, that the closeness was still there, even when the warmth had begun to fade. It was in those moments, when she was quietly left out of conversations, when her contributions were ignored, that the truth was taking shape. But she didn't see it then. She just kept giving, kept trying to be the person they expected her to be, the person she thought they needed her to be. She thought if she just held on, If she just kept doing her part, it would all return to how it used to be. But now, as she sits in that same kitchen, she can feel the weight of the years, the slow accumulation of all the moments when she was pushed to the side. She thinks back to that day, to the quiet conversation at the stove, and realizes that it was the beginning. It wasn't a dramatic break, no sudden outbursts or accusations, but something far more insidious, the slow, subtle erosion of her place in this family. She had been a part of the fabric of it once, woven into the daily life and routines, but now, she was just another thread, left to unravel quietly in the background. It was one of those moments when everything seemed normal on the surface, but there was a quiet tension that tugged at the edges of her awareness. She stood by the door, watching them, her husband, his sister, their mother, gathering around the kitchen island, laughing, planning. They were discussing the upcoming holiday, a gathering she had once been at the center of. But now, the conversation felt distant, as though it was happening in another room. In another life. Her husband, whom she had spent so many years beside, was standing too close to his sister, their heads bent together as they whispered. Her mother-in-law, always the one to steer the family, smiled sweetly at her, but there was something in that smile, something that didn't quite reach her eyes. The words were polite, kind, but the tone carried a weight, a subtle dismissal. "We've made arrangements already, you know," her mother-in-law said, as though the plans had been set long before anyone had bothered to ask if she was available. She smiled back, a tight smile that didn't quite match the warmth she used to feel in those moments. She stayed quiet, watching as the family unit moved seamlessly, without her. The space around her seemed to stretch, growing larger as she was left out of the loop. Her place at the table, once marked by her presence, was now just a space, a gap where she was no longer needed. The chairs were moved around more than they used to be, never in the same arrangement. One evening, as they gathered for dinner, her chair was placed further down the table, away from her husband, away from the heart of the conversation. It wasn't a big gesture, but it was enough to make her feel the absence. She adjusted, of course. She always did. But it didn't stop the quiet sting. The sound of laughter, once something that brought her joy, now felt like a distant echo, fading in and out of her consciousness. She wondered if they realized it, the way the room felt different now, the way her silence wasn't even noticed. There was a time when she was part of the core, when her opinions mattered, when the family listened. Now, it was as if she was a guest in her own home, no longer the heart of the gathering, but someone who simply filled a seat. A casual remark made by her husband, an offhand comment about a decision she wasn't consulted on, drifted through the air like a feather, light, but carrying the weight of something far heavier. He didn't even look at her when he spoke, as though he didn't need to. She kept her gaze low, watching the way they all moved, how they functioned without her input. The soft hum of the refrigerator seemed louder now, the ticking of the clock more pronounced as time seemed to stretch longer between her and the family she thought she knew. She had been silent for so long, choosing not to address it, thinking it would pass. It wasn't until now that she realized how much of her had been quietly erased. Her thoughts, her feelings, her presence, they no longer seemed to matter in the way they once did. The polite words, the sweet smiles, the careful conversations, all of it had been a facade. She was no longer included in the decisions that shaped their lives, no longer part of the warmth of their closeness. And in the quiet, subtle shift of space, she realized the truth. She had been left behind, not with words, but with actions. She wasn't a part of their world anymore. She had been replaced without even knowing it, and the worst part was, she had let it happen. She had let herself be pushed to the edges, accepting the cold silence, the hollow gestures, because she believed it was easier to stay silent than to face the truth. But now, the truth was undeniable, and it hurt more than she ever thought it could. The kitchen was quiet again, the soft hum of the refrigerator the only sound filling the room. She was standing by the sink, washing the dishes, her movements slow and mechanical. It was during this routine that the truth began to crystallize, sharper than ever before. She had always assumed that the small things, the way her opinions were dismissed, the seat that was always further from the center, were just part of the ebb and flow of family life, something that happened naturally. But now, with every plate she washed, every cup she dried, the reality started to settle into her bones. She was no longer a part of this family in the way she once thought. She was here, physically, but emotionally and mentally, she had been erased. She caught a glimpse of her husband's reflection in the window, standing at the table, chatting with his mother and sister. He didn't look at her, not even once. The laughter, the warmth that seemed so genuine, was no longer for her. It was for them, a world she wasn't invited into. She had been replaced, not just in the conversation, but in the very core of the family. They had all subtly moved on, shifted their focus, and in doing so, had claimed their roles without her. She had been a fixture, a tool to keep things running, but she was no longer necessary. The realization hit her like a weight pressing down on her chest. The house, once a sanctuary, now felt like a place where she was tolerated, not loved. The conversations she once had with him, the shared moments of planning and dreaming, had all faded into the background, overshadowed by the needs and wants of others. Even the small gestures that once meant something, a hand held, a look shared, were now absent. Her place, both in the family and in his life, had been slowly taken from her. It wasn't just the small acts of exclusion anymore. It was everything, from the way the house was divided to the way the decisions were made without her. She was no longer the one they turned to for comfort or advice. She had been pushed aside, not with anger, not with raised voices, but with silence, with distance. And it wasn't until this moment, standing alone in the kitchen, that she realized how deeply she had been replaced. She was no longer at the center of their world. She had become a shadow, an afterthought, something that existed on the periphery. The thought twisted in her chest, a quiet fury rising inside her that she couldn't yet express. Her body felt heavy with the weight of it, but she held it in, letting it settle into her bones, where it would remain, an unspoken truth. The realization that she had been quietly, systematically erased stung more than she had expected. But it wasn't loud. There were no dramatic words, no accusations. It was just a slow, subtle process that had stripped her of everything she had once thought was secure. The family, her family, had quietly taken it all away, and she had done nothing but accept it, piece by piece. Now, as she stood there, the plates in her hands seemed heavier than before, and the space around her felt colder. She was invisible now, not because they didn't see her, but because they didn't need to. They had moved on without her, and in the quiet, she realized the truth. She was no longer the person they counted on. She had been replaced, and the worst part was, she had known it all along, but hadn't allowed herself to see it. She was in the living room, sorting through the mail when he walked in. His footsteps were heavy, deliberate, and they echoed in the stillness of the house. She didn't look up immediately, but the way he paused in the doorway, the hesitation in his steps, made her heart tighten. The air felt thick, laden with something unsaid. Then, as if to seal the distance between them, he spoke. His voice was cold, distant, the words sharp and final. "I've already made the decision," he said, his gaze fixed on the floor, avoiding hers entirely. The weight of those words settled like a stone in her chest. There was no room for discussion, no invitation for her opinion, just the harsh finality of his statement. She had known, deep down, that this moment was coming, but hearing the words spoken aloud, was like a punch to the gut. She felt the world around her go still, the noise of the house, the hum of life, fading into a muted silence. She didn't respond. She couldn't. There was nothing left to say. The coldness in his voice, the way he had removed her from the conversation entirely, made it clear she no longer mattered. The decisions were no longer hers to make. She was an observer now, a bystander in a family she had once been an integral part of. Her fingers trembled slightly as she held the envelope in her hand, the paper crinkling under her grip. She could feel the weight of his words pressing down on her, suffocating the air between them. But she didn't move. She didn't react. She just stood there, frozen in place, as though the very ground beneath her had shifted and she hadn't yet found her footing. He turned, leaving the room without another glance, and she remained standing, the letter still in her hands. She watched him go, the space between them widening with each step he took. The door clicked shut behind him, and she remained standing there, motionless, unable to bring herself to follow. The room, once familiar, now felt alien, a place where she no longer belonged. She felt the crushing weight of it, of being erased, of being replaced. The finality of it all settled over her like a blanket, cold and heavy. She had been pushed out, quietly, without confrontation, without explanation. The truth was undeniable now. She was no longer a part of this family, no longer at the center of it all. She had been replaced, and no amount of waiting, no amount of silence, could change that. Slowly, she lowered herself into the nearest chair, her body heavy with the truth. She had always known, in the deepest corners of her mind, that she had been slipping away, but now, the truth was so clear, so painfully real. There was no going back. She had been replaced, and it wasn't just a passing moment. It was the end of something she had once cherished, a part of herself she could never get back. She sat in the kitchen, the same spot where she had once felt the pulse of the family, the warmth of conversations and laughter. Now it was different. She had been sitting there for hours, barely moving, the coffee in her mug long cold. The house felt hollow, a space she no longer belonged in, but one she couldn't bring herself to leave. Her hands were still, resting in her lap, her eyes unfocused on the counter ahead. The room was quiet, the kind of silence that presses in on you, heavy and oppressive. She hadn't touched the dishes yet, but she knew she would. She always did. It was her role now, even if it felt like it didn't belong to her anymore. The kitchen was pristine, every surface gleaming, but she saw only the cracks, the subtle signs of the shift that had taken place. The clutter of old receipts, the stray keys left behind, all the small things that used to be hers to handle were no longer hers to manage. She stood slowly, her body stiff, and moved to the sink, the soft scrape of the sponge against the plate the only sound in the room. She washed each dish slowly, deliberately, the movements mechanical. There was no rush, no reason to hurry. The family was elsewhere, as they always were now. She could hear their voices in the other room, but it was as though they were speaking a language she no longer understood. She focused on the task in front of her, the small actions of washing, drying, putting away. Her fingers ached slightly, the skin red from the constant motion, but it didn't matter. It was all that remained, all that was left for her. Her place in this home, once central, now felt like a forgotten corner, and the dishes were the only thing she still had control over. She didn't need to be asked to do them. She knew it was her place, her duty. The family had moved on, and so she stayed, quietly cleaning up their mess, picking up the pieces they left behind. The routine had become a comfort, a way to avoid facing the reality that she was no longer part of their world. It was easier to stay silent, to let the days pass in the rhythm of chores, than to confront the emptiness that had settled in her heart. She finished the dishes and placed the last cup on the shelf, the sound of it settling into place like the final note of a song that had lost its melody. She stepped back, looking at the kitchen, the place that had once felt like the center of everything, and realized that it no longer held the same meaning. It wasn't hers anymore. It had been claimed by others, by a family that no longer needed her. She moved slowly to the window, looking out at the garden. The flowers bloomed just as they always had, but the view no longer seemed familiar, no longer felt like home. The world outside moved on, unaffected by the stillness inside the house. She stood there for a long time, watching, feeling the weight of her own absence. She wasn't angry, not yet. There was no need for anger. The truth had settled in quietly, without fanfare. She had been replaced. Her role, once central, was now just a memory. The family continued, and she was left behind. The moment was undeniable now, the truth clear. There was no place for her here anymore. Her hands were still, her body aching with the weight of what had happened, but there was nothing she could do. The world had moved on without her. And so, she remained, silent and still, in a house that no longer belonged to her. The quiet stillness of the house stretched into the late evening, the only sound the soft shuffle of papers on the kitchen table. She had been sitting there for a while, her eyes fixed on the documents in front of her, the faint light from the overhead lamp casting long shadows across the table. It was a slow, deliberate process, the way her fingers moved over the papers, each document carefully organized, each decision already made in the silence of her mind. There was no rush, no need for any hasty words or grand gestures. The time for explanations was long gone. She had already accepted what needed to be done. The house, the assets, the things that once tied her to this family, they were now just a collection of items to be handled, pieces of a puzzle she no longer needed to solve. Her role in this family, the place she had once fought to maintain, was no longer hers. It had been quietly taken, and with it, her need for approval. She no longer needed to be the center of it all. The house was no longer her home, and it was no longer her responsibility. She glanced out the window again, the garden bathed in the soft glow of the streetlights. It all looked the same, yet it felt so different. The flowers bloomed, the trees swayed gently in the breeze, but none of it was hers anymore. She took a deep breath, letting the weight of the decision settle in. It wasn't anger she felt, nor regret. It was something quieter, something more final. She wasn't waiting for an invitation anymore. She wasn't looking for permission. She didn't need their approval to move forward. She picked up the pen, her grip firm but controlled, and signed the papers. No ceremony, no fanfare, just a quiet act that sealed the future she had already chosen. She had no intention of going back. No intention of reclaiming what had been lost. This was no longer about fitting in, no longer about being part of a family that had moved on without her. She was done waiting for them to see her, for them to recognize her place in the world they had built without her. Her place was elsewhere now. She folded the papers neatly, her movements precise, and placed them in an envelope. She didn't need to explain herself. She didn't need to ask for their permission. It was done. She stood up slowly, the envelope in her hand, and walked to the door. The house that had once been her world felt smaller now, less significant. As though she had outgrown it, as though it had outgrown her. She didn't look back as she closed the door behind her. The decision had been made. The past was behind her, and the future was hers to shape. It was a quiet, resolute shift, a transformation that didn't require a single word, a single confrontation. Just the simple act of taking control, of walking away, and letting go. The envelope was sealed, and with a calm, deliberate motion, she placed it in the mailbox. Her fingers lingered on the metal handle, but there was no hesitation this time, no lingering doubt. The decision had been made. The ties that once bound her to this house, to this family, had been severed. She had given them her time, her effort, her love, but in return, she had received only distance, only silence. The home, once warm and familiar, now felt like a distant memory, a place she had outgrown, a place where she no longer belonged. She stood there for a moment longer, the evening air cool against her skin, the quiet hum of the world around her the only sound. Her gaze wandered over the house, but it was no longer her house. The walls, the windows, the garden, all of it was a reminder of the person she had once been, the person who had been needed, who had been at the center of it all. But that person no longer existed. What she had once fought for, what she had once hoped to return to, was no longer her reality. She had let go, not in anger, but in quiet acceptance, in the peaceful realization that she was enough on her own. She was not defined by the family, by their recognition, by their approval. She was defined by herself, by her own choices, by her ability to stand on her own 2 feet. As she turned away from the mailbox, her movements were steady, sure. The weight she had carried for so long, the constant striving, the need to be seen and heard, had melted away. There was no more waiting for validation, no more hoping for a place at the table. She had built her own path, one that didn't rely on the family's approval. She no longer needed their recognition to feel whole. The decision had been made. The future was hers to shape. There was no need for confrontation, no need for explanation. She had chosen a life of peace, of self-respect, and now, with the final act of sealing that envelope, she could move forward without looking back. As she walked away from the house, the quiet finality of the moment settled in. It was over, and she was free. What once felt like the end of something was now the beginning of a new chapter, one she would write herself. She didn't need to prove anything. She didn't need anyone to validate her. She had found her strength, and in doing so, had taken back what was always hers to begin with. And as she took one last look at the house, she realized something. She had never truly left. She had only been waiting to find herself again.